November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest. A seasoned German sniper lies motionless in the freezing timber. He is watching a wounded American infantryman drag himself across a snow-covered minefield. The snow around the boy is turning a deep, slick black. He is screaming. The sniper's finger rests heavy on the trigger of his Mauser rifle. He has the shot, but he doesn't pull it. He can't. For weeks, Field Marshal Walther Model's meat grinder has systematically dismantled the United States Army. It is a masterclass in slaughter. American Sherman tanks are bogged down in the icy mud, completely useless. The mighty Allied air support is completely grounded by the bitter overcast skies, and whatever planes do make it off the runway are entirely blinded by the dense, towering canopy. And from the sky, German artillery doesn't strike the ground. The shells are rigged to detonate in the treetops, raining jagged steel and razor-sharp wooden shrapnel down into the American foxholes. By every known law of military doctrine, these frozen, decimated American platoons should have broken. They should have thrown down their weapons and surrendered in absolute panic. Instead, they did something that completely baffled the German high command. What happened in that dark, sub-zero timberland wasn't just a catastrophic failure of Allied leadership. It was the ultimate, terrifying display of the American G.I. Today, we are going to look through the binoculars of the very German commanders who engineered this perfect death trap. We are going to witness a level of raw discipline, brotherhood, and humanity that forced even the most hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht to lower their weapons in sheer awe. This is the untold truth of the Hürtgen Forest. Deep beneath the earth, safe from the driving rain, Field Marshal Walther Model stood over a sprawling map table. The air inside the German Army Group B command bunker was warm. It smelled of strong coffee and stale cigarette smoke. To Model, the Hürtgen Forest was not a place of horror. It was a mathematical equation. He was Hitler's premier defensive tactician, and he looked at warfare as a machine built to process and break the human spirit. He dragged his finger across 50 square miles of dense, ancient fir trees. He calculated the density of the timber. He factored in the plunging temperatures. He knew the thick canopy would completely blind the Allied air forces, neutralizing the lethal American P-47 Thunderbolts. But Model wasn't just trying to destroy bodies. He was calculating the exact formula required to shatter a human mind. Sever the supply lines, plunge them into bone-chilling darkness, bleed them from every angle. In his mind, it was simple arithmetic. Reach a certain threshold of suffering, and the American troops would break. They would rout. They would surrender. Because in the totalitarian machine of the Third Reich, a soldier was merely a number on a ledger. Conscripts expected to follow orders until they died. Miles away, inside a wind-battered canvas tent, the math ended. Major General Norman Dutch Cotter stood by a field radio, listening to the agonizing reality of his command. The transmission was broken, choked with static, and the distant, rhythmic thumping of German artillery. He heard the panicked voice of a young lieutenant calling for fire support that didn't exist. Then, just dead air. Cotter was not a man who commanded comfortably from behind a desk. He was the general who had walked upright across the bloody, bullet-swept sands of Omaha Beach, rallying pinned-down soldiers under heavy machine gun fire. He knew exactly what slaughter looked like. But Omaha Beach had a beginning and an end. Hurtgen was a black ocean of trees that swallowed his men whole. His 28th Infantry Division, the proud Keystone Division, boys from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, wearing the red patch on their shoulders, was bleeding out in the dark. Cotter rubbed his face, feeling the crushing weight of every 19-year-old kid he had just ordered into the woodline. He knew what they were walking into. He knew his armor couldn't save them. To understand the absolute helplessness of the mighty American war machine in Hürtgen, you only have to look at the Kall Trail. It wasn't a road, it was a glorified deer path, a narrow, winding dirt track etched into the side of a steep, heavily wooded gorge. The relentless autumn rains had turned the trail into a river of icy, waist-deep sludge. An American M4 Sherman tank is a beast of modern engineering, 30 tons of hardened Detroit steel. But on the Kall Trail it was a 30-ton iron coffin. Imagine the deafening roar of the massive engine, whining and smoking in the bitter air as the steel tracks dug fruitlessly into the mud. The smell of burning clutch plates filling the gorge. The tank slipped, just a few inches at first. Then, the massive machine began sliding sideways toward the jagged drop-off. The crew screamed, desperately kicking open the steel hatches and bailing out into the bitter mud just as the tank rolled over the edge, crashing through the ancient pines and slamming into the bottom of the gorge. One slipped tank. That was all it took. The narrow trail was completely blocked. Nothing could get forward, no armor, no heavy artillery, no hot rations for the exhausted, frost-bitten men on the line, and far more devastating, the ambulances couldn't get back. The vaunted American military, the unstoppable industrial might of a superpower, was completely paralyzed by mud, wood, and German engineering. It was down to the men in the dirt. American combat engineers, sent into the forest to clear the roads, realized the bitter truth. There would be no roads. They stood in the driving rain, looking at their chainsaws and their heavy shovels. Then they threw them into the mud. They walked over to the bodies of fallen infantrymen, picked up cold, mud-caked M1 Garand rifles, wiped the bolts clean, and walked into the tree line to fight. They had no armor, they had no sky, they only had each other. Down in the valley floor, where the sludge swallowed a man up to his calves, the German combat engineers had planted a different kind of nightmare. The Schu-mine 42. There was almost no metal in it. It was just a small, cheap wooden box. To the American minesweepers sweeping their metal detectors back and forth through the snow, the forest floor registered as completely clear. The Wehrmacht had designed it that way. The Schu-mine wasn't built to kill an American soldier. Walther Model's mathematicians knew that a dead soldier only removed one rifle from the line. But a soldier with his heel and shin bone blown away by a half-pound of TNT, he would scream. He would bleed, and he would immediately drag 3 or 4 of his able-bodied brothers out of the fight just to carry him back down the trail. It was a weapon designed to exploit the American conscience. The sickening crack of splintering pine under a rubber sole became the most terrifying sound in the woods. But a man didn't even have to step on a mine to lose his legs in Hürtgen. The forest itself was eating the men alive. The autumn rains were relentless, soaking through the standard issue canvas jackets and pooling inside the men's leather combat boots. When the sun went down, the temperature plummeted below freezing. The mud inside the foxholes turned to concrete. The men couldn't light a fire. Striking a single match in the dark meant drawing an instant, devastating mortar barrage from the German lines. So they sat in the pitch blackness. Water trapped inside their boots began to freeze. The blood vessels in their toes constricted, then collapsed. Trench foot. Imagine a 19-year-old kid from a warm farm in Texas, sitting in a hole half filled with ice water. His hands are shaking so violently he can barely hold his bayonet. He takes the blade and desperately saws at the thick leather of his own boots, slicing the laces and the sides open just to relieve the agonizing pressure. His feet are swelling to twice their normal size, the flesh turning a sickly, gangrenous black. Every single step is like walking on broken glass. But to stay still meant losing the foot entirely, or freezing to death. They were miserable. They were in unimaginable pain. They were entirely cut off from the massive war machine that had brought them to Europe. We obsess over generals moving flags on maps. We study grand strategies and logistical turning points. But the truth is, the weight of a war is ultimately carried by a 19-year-old boy freezing in a hole, who is simply too terrified of letting his buddies down to run away. But the elements and the mines were only the floor of Walther Model's slaughterhouse. The true terror came from the roof. When a combat infantryman is caught in an artillery barrage, his deepest, most primal instinct is to dig. You dig until your hands bleed. You get below the surface of the earth. You press your helmet into the dirt, and you pray the shells hit the ground somewhere else. But in the Hürtgen Forest, a foxhole was not a sanctuary, it was a catcher's mitt. The German artillery batteries, safely entrenched miles behind the lines, weren't aiming for the mud. They were aiming for the canopy. Using highly calibrated time fuses, the German gunners set their heavy artillery shells to detonate not on impact with the earth, but 50 to 70 feet in the air, right in the dense crowns of the ancient fir trees. Tree bursts. Imagine sitting in a dark hole, clutching your frost-hardened rifle. You hear the distant, sickening thump of the guns from the German ridges. Then, the tearing, freight train roar of the incoming shells ripping through the cold air. But the explosion doesn't shake the ground. It shatters the sky. When a high-explosive shell detonates in the treetops, it doesn't just scatter downward in a cone of red-hot, jagged steel shrapnel. The sheer concussive force of the blast vaporizes the massive pine trunks, turning thousands of thick, heavy branches into razor-sharp wooden spears, driving them straight down at a lethal velocity. There was no cover. There was nowhere to hide from a threat that came directly from above. The men simply had to curl into a ball at the bottom of their flooded holes, close their eyes, and listen to the forest tearing their friends apart. The smell of fresh, splintered pine sap hung heavy in the damp air, sickeningly mixed with the sharp scent of burnt cordite and the metallic, copper stench of blood. Back in the concrete bunkers of Army Group B, the reports began flooding into German command. The casualty numbers were staggering. German forward observers, peering through their Zeiss optics through the morning fog, reported that the American lines were being systematically pulverized. The 28th Infantry Division was taking the absolute brunt of the horror. The German troops looked at the shape of the red keystone patch worn on the shoulders of the American dead, and they gave it a new, grim nickname. They called it the Bloody Bucket. And the bucket was overflowing. Platoons were being reduced to squads in a single afternoon. Rifle companies were losing 70, sometimes of 80% of their combat strength in a matter of days. To truly understand the absolute nightmare the American infantry faced, you have to look deeper into Walther Model's defensive blueprints. He didn't just rely on the trees and the mud, he integrated the forest into the west wall, the infamous Siegfried Line. General der Infanterie Hans Schmidt, commander of the German 275th Division, had spent months preparing the ground. Hidden beneath the thick moss and fallen pine needles were reinforced concrete pillboxes. They were built with walls 3 feet thick, impervious to standard infantry weapons. They were camouflaged so perfectly into the hillsides that American troops often didn't realize they were standing right on top of a German bunker until the ground beneath them erupted in gunfire. Inside these concrete fortresses sat the most terrifying infantry weapon of the Second World War. The Maschinengewehr 42, the MG-42. To the American G.I, the sound of this weapon was paralyzing. Most heavy machine guns of the era fired at a cyclic rate of around 400 to 500 rounds per minute. You could hear the individual bullets popping. The MG-42 fired at a staggering 100-200 rounds per minute. It fired so fast that the human ear could not distinguish the individual gunshots. It sounded like a massive sheet of heavy canvas being violently ripped in half. General Schmidt had engineered overlapping fields of fire. When an American platoon advanced into a clearing, they weren't just hit by one gun. They were instantly caught in a crossfire of 2 or 3 MG-42s, creating an intersecting wall of supersonic lead that sheared through the pine saplings like a massive scythe. German machine gunners were trained to swap out the red-hot steel barrels in mere seconds, slapping a fresh barrel into the receiver and resuming the slaughter before the Americans could even raise their heads from the dirt. The German commanders believed this overwhelming mechanical superiority would permanently pin the Americans down. Tanks couldn't reach the bunkers. Fighter planes couldn't see them. According to standard military doctrine, the very mathematical formulas that Field Marshal Walther Model worshipped. An infantry unit that sustains a 30% casualty rate is officially rendered combat ineffective. At 30%, men lose unit cohesion, they lose their nerve, they lose the will to fight. The German commanders waited. They waited for the panicked screams of men finally breaking. They expected the American army, stripped of its armor and its officers, to turn its back and run blindly into the woods. But the Germans underestimated the stubborn mechanical ingenuity of the American infantry squad. If they couldn't bring 30 tons of armor up the muddy ridges, they would carry their heavy firepower on their own backs. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun. The Marjus. It was a weapon designed to shoot down aircraft and rip through armored vehicles. It weighed 84 pounds, not including the massive steel tripod and the heavy cans of belted ammunition. It was never meant to be carried by hand through miles of waist-deep sludge, but the American G.I. didn't care about the manual. Exhausted, frostbitten, and starving, squads of young Americans strapped the heavy steel receivers to their backs. They crawled through the mud under heavy German fire, dragging the massive tripods and boxes of half-inch brass cartridges up the steep, slippery ravines. When an American weapons squad finally set up an M2 Browning in the woodline, the entire dynamic of the battle shifted. The MG-42 was fast, but the M2 Browning was a sledgehammer. Ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. The slow, earth-shaking rhythm of the .50 caliber echoed through the gorge. The massive armor-piercing rounds didn't just suppress the German infantry. They punched straight through the thick trunks of the ancient fir trees. They shattered the concrete lips of the German firing slits. German officers in their command bunkers listened in disbelief as the sheer blunt force trauma of American heavy weapons began to systematically dismantle their impenetrable defensive line, one bunker at a time. It was a brutal, intimate war of attrition. It wasn't decided by grand maneuvers, but by the sheer, stubborn willpower of 19-year-old boys operating heavy machinery with bleeding, frost-hardened hands. The chain of command had vanished into the mud. Company captains, seasoned lieutenants, and grizzled platoon sergeants. The men who held the tactical maps and shouted the orders were bleeding out in the snow. The communication wires were shredded by shrapnel. In the eyes of the German officers peering through the fog, this should have been the absolute end. To the Wehrmacht, an army was a machine of strict obedience. If you remove the officers, the machine stops. Without a commanding voice to dictate where to shoot and when to move, conscripts were expected to freeze, to wait, to surrender. But Field Marshal Model made a fatal miscalculation. He judged the American soldier by the standards of a totalitarian regime. He did not understand the inherent, untamed initiative of free men. When the American officers fell, the American advance didn't stop. Out of the bloody foxholes, men who had no business commanding combat troops simply stood up. A 19-year-old mechanic from Brooklyn, a baker from Ohio, a farmer from Texas wearing the worn stripes of a corporal, or even just the single chevron of a private. They wiped the mud from their faces. They picked up the heavy radios. They grabbed the Browning automatic rifles from the cold hands of their fallen brothers. And they took command. They didn't wait for a whistle to blow. They didn't need a commanding officer to threaten them with a firing squad to keep them in the line. The American G.I. wasn't fighting for a grand ideology. He wasn't fighting for a fanatic dictator. He was fighting because the boy freezing in the dirt right next to him needed covering fire. Walther Model's perfectly engineered machine was built to break armies, but it had absolutely no idea how to break a brotherhood of free citizens. Before we walk further into the dark woods of Hürtgen, if you value these raw, unfiltered stories of the greatest generation, please take a second to leave a like on this video. It is the best way to ensure their sacrifices are remembered, and these stories find the people who need to hear them. High up in the splintered canopy, a German sniper peered through his Zeiss telescopic sight. Down below, in the grey fog of no man's land, the snow was littered with the wounded men of the American 28th Infantry. According to Wehrmacht sniper doctrine, a wounded enemy was far more valuable than a dead one. A dead man is just a corpse, but a screaming, bleeding man, he is bait. The German snipers and MG-42 machine gunners were trained to wait. Let the wounded man cry out. Wait for his comrades to break cover to drag him back to the foxhole, and then cut them all down. It was cold. It was calculating. It was the brutal mathematics of Hürtgen. But as the German infantrymen watched the mud, they witnessed something that completely shattered their training. Through the dense smoke, a figure crawled out from the American lines. He wasn't carrying an M1 Garand. He wasn't carrying a Thompson submachine gun. He was completely unarmed. The only thing he wore was a white armband with a red cross, stained dark brown with icy mud and dried blood. An American combat medic. To the German officers watching through their binoculars, this was absolute tactical madness. Why risk a healthy, able-bodied man, especially a highly trained medic, to drag a crippled soldier through a dense Schu-mine field? It defied all military logic, but the medic didn't stop. He dragged himself on his stomach, pushing through the bitter slush, inching his way toward the agonizing screams of a wounded G.I. Suddenly, the sharp, terrifying shriek of an incoming artillery shell echoed through the valley. The sniper watched through his scope. He expected the medic to dive for the nearest crater, to protect himself at all costs. Instead, the medic finally reached the wounded boy and threw his own body completely over him. He shielded the broken American with his own flesh and bone, waiting for the iron rain of shrapnel to tear through the trees. When the smoke cleared, the medic calmly sat up, pulled a small syringe of morphine from his webbing, and began to bandage the boy's shredded leg right there in the open snow. The German sniper had his crosshairs resting dead center on the medic's chest. A single pound of pressure on the trigger was all it took, but his hand trembled. All across the German woodline, something incredible was happening. The heavy MG-42 machine guns went entirely silent. The Mauser rifles were slowly lowered. The German infantrymen, hardened killers who had survived the slaughter of the Eastern Front, simply stopped shooting. They could not bring themselves to pull the trigger on a man who was so willingly sacrificing his own life for a brother. It wasn't an order from the German High Command. There was no official ceasefire. It was the sheer, undeniable power of American humanity, and amidst this mechanical slaughter, something else emerged from the mud. A level of humanity that defies all comprehension. Deep in the Kall River Gorge, the American medical system had completely collapsed. The narrow, muddy trail was blocked by destroyed vehicles. Hundreds of wounded Americans were trapped in the bitter valley. They were piled into a small, ruined stone church in the town of Kommerscheid, and in a small log cabin near the Kall Bridge. Blood pooled on the dirt floors. Men were dying of shock and hypothermia before their wounds could even be treated. A German regimental doctor, Hauptmann Günther Stüttgen, surveyed the horrific scene near the bridge. He was a sworn officer of the Wehrmacht. His duty was to the Third Reich. But as a physician looking at the agonizing suffering of hundreds of shattered young men, both German and American, the uniform ceased to matter. In the middle of the most brutal battle on the Western Front, Captain Stüttgen did the unthinkable. Under the heavy cover of fog, he approached the American lines. He didn't bring a weapon. He brought an offer of mercy. Stüttgen successfully negotiated an unofficial, localized ceasefire with the American commanders. For a brief, miraculous window of time between November 7th and 9th, the guns in the Kall Gorge fell completely silent. American and German medics, men who had been trying to kill each other just hours before, walked out into the open. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud. German litter bearers helped carry wounded Americans out of the minefields. American doctors shared their dwindling supplies of penicillin and morphine with wounded German teenagers. Inside the small aid stations, enemies bled on the same floor, treated by the same hands. It was a stunning rejection of the war itself. Walther Model's grand strategy relied entirely on the concept of total, uncompromising annihilation. But in the darkest corners of his perfect trap, the profound decency of the frontline soldier stubbornly refused to die. Deep into that bitter November, the frost laid heavy on the ground. Between the American and German lines stretched a deadly expanse of cratered earth, known as the Wildered Saw, the Wild Boar minefield. As the morning fog rolled through the shattered pines, a sound drifted across the quiet battlefield. It was a voice. "Help me." An American infantryman, separated from his retreating squad, lay gravely wounded in the absolute center of the German minefield. He was alone, he was bleeding out into the snow, and he was terrified. "Help me, please." For hours his frantic cries echoed through the trees. The American lines were simply too far back. No medic could reach him without being torn to pieces by shrapnel. On the German side of the woodline, Leutnant Friedrich Lengfeld sat in his trench. He was the commander of the 2nd Company, 275th Infantry Battalion, a combat officer, a man sworn to destroy the United States Army. But for days, Lengfeld had watched the American G.I. He had watched boys from Texas and New York willingly walk into the jaws of death just to pull a wounded brother to safety. He had watched a level of pure human devotion that simply did not exist in the brutal mechanical training manuals of the Third Reich. And now he listened to the agonizing cries of a dying American boy. The hours ticked by. The voice grew weaker, turning into a shivering, desperate sob. Lengfeld could not take it anymore. The fierce humanity he had witnessed from the American lines had finally broken the cold machinery of his German training. He stood up in the trench. He looked at his men, and he issued a strict, undeniable order: do not fire. Lengfeld didn't send a medic, he didn't send a conscript. He took a Red Cross vest, held it up in the air, and climbed out of the safety of his trench. A German combat officer, stepping completely exposed into no man's land. He slowly walked into the wild saw minefield, carefully stepping through the hard earth, his eyes fixed on the dying American boy. He was going to save him, but the Hürtgen Forest showed no mercy. A sickening crack echoed through the gorge. Lengfeld had stepped on a German mine. The blast threw him into the snow, shredding his body. He was frantically dragged back to the German lines by his men, but it was too late. He died hours later in an aid station. Decades after the guns fell silent, the veterans of the American 22nd Infantry Regiment, the very men who fought and bled in that dark forest, did something completely unprecedented. They traveled to a military cemetery in Germany, and they built a monument, not for an American general, but for Friedrich Lengfeld. It stands there today, a heavy bronze plaque placed by American hands, honoring the German officer who gave his life trying to save an American boy. They didn't build it to glorify the enemy. They built it because the story of Friedrich Lengfeld proves something absolutely remarkable about the American infantryman. Even in the darkest, coldest, most brutal meat grinder of the Second World War, the moral courage of the American G.I. shone so intensely, it forced the enemy to step out of the dark and try to find the light. When the surviving men of the American infantry finally fought their way out of the Hürtgen Forest, they left behind a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Strategically, the German army had achieved their offensive goal. They had delayed the Allied advance. They had bought time for their massive winter offensive in the Ardennes. But at what psychological cost? Walther Model had calculated everything. The steep ravines, the impenetrable timber, the devastating rain of artillery from the sky. But his machine ultimately failed to break the one thing he could not measure: the American spirit. When the GIs walked past the tactical maps and the command tents, they did not march in crisp parade ground formations. Their uniforms were shredded. Their boots were soaked in icy mud and blood. They carried the unimaginable psychological weight of the brothers they had to leave behind in the dark. But they did not look like a broken army. They looked straight ahead with the terrifying, unyielding stare of free men. They had faced the most brutal, mechanical slaughterhouse of the Second World War, a forest specifically designed by the Third Reich to strip away their humanity and crush their minds. And the men in the dirt did not break. History books often summarize these battles with sweeping arrows on a map and staggering casualty numbers. But the real history of the Hürtgen Forest was written in the mud by young boys who simply refused to let their brothers die alone. Many of you watching this right now have fathers, grandfathers, or uncles who fought in that hell, or across the islands of the Pacific, or in the skies over Europe. They came home, they went back to work. They sat at the family dinner table, and perhaps, in a quiet moment, they shared a memory with you. A story of a buddy they lost, a fleeting moment of terror, or a small act of grace in the middle of a brutal war. Those stories are not recorded in any official military archive. Don't let those stories disappear. If you carry one of those memories, if you remember the name of a man who didn't come home, please share it in the comments below. Let this be a living memorial to the men of the greatest generation. We owe it to them to remember. Thank you for watching, and God bless the infantry.